Check one, two, three. Hey everybody, it's Michael Helms, also known as Michael the Sound Guy, and this is the Location Sound Podcast. You know, each episode we talk with location sound mixers, boom ops, and other industry pros about the various aspects of recording sound on location, whether it's for feature and independent films, TV commercials, interviews, any time where dialogue from actors is recorded. I started my career in the recording studios in New York City with some of the big artists back in the day, and later on projects for networks like HBO, Sci-Fi Channel, and the Cartoon Network. As time went by, I got out of the studio and began working in production sound. Whether you're a seasoned veteran or just starting out, thanks for joining us. Okay, my guest today is a sound mixer and boom op based out of the Baltimore, Washington, D.C. area. He's worked on Tom Clancy's Jack Ryan, House of Cards, the HBO series Veep, and on the feature Kill the Messenger starring Jeremy Renner. Please welcome Steve Saada.
How's it going?
All right, now, Steve, we always start the show by asking, when you're mixing on set, what's in your audio kit? So tell us about your mics, your mixer, power distribution, and everything in between.
All right. So for a long time, I had a Sound Device 788 as my main bag system, and I've just recently upgraded to a 633, especially for my back. It's fantastic. But I have a 633 as my main mixer recorder in my bag with Lectrosonics wireless. So I have one SRC wideband and a couple 411s left over, trying to work my way up to more SRCs. But I have one wideband transmitter and a couple other SMV transmitters. Power distro, I have a PSC PowerStar Mini that I used on my 788, and now on my 633, I have the audio route. I can just like the BG2, I think it's called, just the smaller one, and it's awesome. I love it to death with the smart batteries, the 98 watt hour smart batteries. And for mics, I use COS-11s and Countryman B6s. I love buttonholes, so Countrymans are the best. And I use, in terms of mics on my pole, I use 50s. So I love my 50. And shotgun, I use a CS3E. And timecode, I use all the new Betso TCX2 wireless transceiver timecode boxes, which are really, really cool. That's about it. Standard Comtex and G3s for wireless hops.
What kind of bag you put all that in?
So I've shoved in almost everything into I guess it's the K-Tech Junior. It's the smallest of the bag that fits the 633. So I've kind of shoved in an SRC, and I can fit two 411s in it. So I can run 4 wires and a boom in my bag with camera hops kind of hanging off the sides and, buried. And yeah, I don't know. I can kind of fit everything into this small bag rather than upgrading to the bigger bag just to have as low profile as possible. I like being really small and clean, and everything's low profile cables for my whole bag. So it pretty much never changes unless I really need to shed weight, but kind of stays the way it is. So it just barely fits, but it's good.
So what kind of headphones do you like?
So I have 7506s that I kind of have plugged in generally, in the wintertime, just because it keeps my ears a little warm. So I use the Garfield ear covers too as well. And I kind of have like 4 or 5 of them that I go through like a year just because they get so messed up. But when it's not cold, so most of the year I use JH Audio in-ears. Before that, I use Eddie Modic in-ears, and they're great. They're, cost effective. But once I jumped up to the JH Audios a couple of years ago, it was like a whole new world opened up, and I've fallen in love with them. So, all
right. Yeah. Tell the listeners a little bit about the in-ear.
Yeah. So I'm actually wearing them now to monitor with this, but I have the JH13 Pro V2s, I think. So there's 6 drivers in each ear, so 12 drivers total, and it's fully custom molded to your ear, loops around the top of your ear, and they have like a 48-inch and a 64-inch cable on it, so you can go low, and they all have you can use a tweaker. They come with this little chamber that you can change low-end response and high-end response on it, but I just keep it flat. The response on these things is pretty remarkable. I actually got introduced to them by Stickman Sound because I started following him on Instagram, and I saw he was posting all these pictures of his JH Audio. So I was like, I've been meaning to do in-ears, and so I gave him a shot, and never going back. They're pretty amazing. Super safe for your ears too. It lets you listen on a much lower level, which is great. And they even give you the option of putting in an ambient vent. So they'll bore a very small little hole in that'll give you, can't remember what the stats are, but it's like I can't remember. I think it's like a 6 or a 12 dB difference, with isolation. I know some people that have JH audios that have the vent. I do not have the vent, but I mostly, when I boom operate and even when I mix, I usually just have one ear in. I just like having one ear open all the time. So I'll usually always have one in my right ear. Sometimes I'll switch just for ear fatigue throughout the day, but I highly recommend JH audio. They're a killer.
Yeah, Fernando Delgado from Stickman Sound. He's been on the podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah, great resource. And yeah, I remember him. We definitely talked about in-ear as well. So cool. Let's talk a little bit about, you do a lot of boom work. Tell the listeners what an average day is like when you first walk on set for a show like, say, House of Cards.
Okay. Well, House of Cards, it's funny because the two main shows that I've worked on have been House of Cards and Veep, and they kind of worked. I did both shows almost at the same time, totally different shows. So House of Cards, pretty laid back mornings. It wasn't a huge rush every morning. So it was always like an hour and a half, 2 hours from call time to shoot call. So, we'd show up and, if we're on stage, and we had 5 stages for House of Cards. So if we're on stage, we always have our spots. So we'll move to our spots and slowly move over our cards. And I'll always start managing all of the wires and stuff like that. I'll set up my boom, change my batteries in my HM, after getting our mixers cart situated with power and everything, I'll start doing everything at the follow cart. So I'll re-battery, all our transmitters, and sometimes depending on where we're at, we'll scan frequencies. I'll scan on his machine, and, I'll clean up some wires here and there, depending on what we did the day before or whatever. And, and then for locations, it's usually the same, but I'll almost immediately start. Once I finish all of the wiring, cleaning up wires and stuff, I'll kind of walk around set and see if we need carpets, if we're on hardwood floor, if it's creaky floors. A lot of the houses we shot in Baltimore are super old townhouses, so we're dealing with really creaky floors. So I'm getting baby powder, I'm getting carpets, while my utility is also, I'm relaying a lot of the stuff to my utility. And, we're kind of both going at it, trying to listen for HVAC and, heating elements, seeing what the shot might end up being. We kind of go into House of Cards, we kind of went into it having a general idea of what our coverage is, depending on where we're at, especially on the stages whenever we're in the White House or the Oval Office that we had, which was incredible. It was almost a given that we would always start with the camera in the fireplace or right in front of the fireplace, symmetrical, looking back at this, at the desk, seeing everything, 18 mil, 21 mil, something like that. And they'd try to fit a B camera in on the side someplace, but there's a lot of times where we didn't end up doing 2 cameras for the first setup. So we'd always do that wide static shot, or sometimes they'd be, put a little push into it, but we'd always, there's always a joke, like Gary J is the operator, the 8 camera operator, just amazing guy. And, we'd walk in and kind of look at each other and be like, so, you gonna go in the fireplace? He's like, I don't know, maybe we'll see how it goes. And it's just always, it doesn't matter. We're always in the fireplace. It's very rare that we're not. Sometimes it's either fireplace or behind the desk. So it's like, what big wide do you want to see? And, every season it got bigger and wider because with House of Cards, we ended up using, new red technology every year. As far as I know, we were some of the first shows to use their 4K sensors and then their 6K sensors. And then I know Stranger Things and other shows use their helium 8K sensors. But, as that sensor gets bigger, the frame just gets wider and wider and wider. And it started pushing everybody out. It was really funny. So we'd always be like, okay, we're seeing the room now, guys. We're getting closer. Can we just change it up? Let's not be in the fireplace at the desk. But so assessing that stuff was always fun on the stage just because it was a little bit laid back, but on location, it's always kind of crazy. So one thing I always do, once I have my wire set up and, batteried, and I have my IFB on and my PL talkback on, and, I just stretch. Because it's like one thing I don't see enough people doing. And it's on House of Cards, it was like a thing. Like we wouldn't do it together all the time, but we would all, people would stretch. So I'd go find some place and just stretch a little bit just to get through the day because it's a boom heavy show. So I'd stretch, and throughout the day, if we had like a long setup or, long turnaround or something like that, all of a sudden you'd see all the camera people on set doing planks. So everyone would drop and start doing planks just to get a little exercise, or something, or start doing push-ups, and everyone's starting to do push-ups. It was really fun kind of environment. I'd watch rehearsal with my utility most of the time because House of Cards was a pretty heavy two-boom show. We're kind of off to the wings a little bit, because they're very particular about their rehearsals and their movement and setting marks on House of Cards, which is great. Because House of Cards is, it's driven by this style that Fincher established where it's I'm not going to go too into it because I'm just a sound guy, but, there's always this movement with it. There's no panning or tilting, barely. If there is, it's all hidden. It's all in dolly movement. So it's constant dance floor all over the floor. We know that when we're on stage, especially, we know we had a whole carpet cart with like 30 carpets in it. And that was on the stage that lived there because we knew that we were going to be putting carpet down for all the dance floor, all the long walk and talks that we had. We'd watch rehearsal and, I'd assess how I would do it and, what I think we could do to achieve the scene and whether we can do two booms, one boom, two booms and a couple wires, here and there, fill in one line here with a wire there, what I can get, what I can't get. The stage was comfortable because we knew issues with reflection. So like Oval Office, we always had a pain. It was always a pain to deal with the grandfather clock because there was always a mirror. There's like glass in that grandfather clock, and all the glass is also curved, so we deal with curved glass, and almost never dealt with shadow problems. So it was never, because that show, Tony Mara's the key grip. Jim Tynes was our gaffer for a bit, but rest in peace. Unfortunately, he passed away in the middle of season 6, or right before, during our hiatus of season 6, he passed away. So our rigging key grip, Russell Wicks, who was our local guy too in Baltimore, he took over as the gaffer and he was great. But our grip electric team was amazing, and how we pre-rigged everything. It was almost, a lot of indirect bounced light. Everything was built into the ceiling almost. We had pins everywhere for Lecos that were bouncing into dropped curtains, and in the Oval Office and most of the stages we had, our key grip he installed these projection screens all over our sets in the ceiling, so he could remote control and bring down all of these white bounces anywhere he wants, at any height he wants, bring it right down to the edge of the frame. And he would they'd bring in kind of a couple Ecos, and they'd have these, they called them birds, but they were these corrugated plastic, I think, little, bottomers that were just kind of clipped onto and wrapped around the Leco. And they cleaned up a lot of the bleed of the Leco, which was great. They say they did it for us, but, I know they did it just to keep it clean, but I know they did it for us too, which was great. But it was super simple. There not a lot of occasions where there was a lot of stands around. So, we can kind of free float and be wherever we need to be. And a lot of stuff we ended up two booming. And the other thing is, and I'll definitely talk about this, is, we always had this in our back pocket that we could paint our boom pulls out of shots, because that was our thing that we did every day. Knowing that we had that in our arsenal, we'd find, ways to not wire in a lot of scenes and just get, not tight mics, but get perspective mics on 250 swinging on a big wide shot. We could swing anywhere we want with a lot of criteria that we'd have to meet, but we could swing around and get what we need to and not have to worry about wiring, because we knew that it was, House of Cards is, wide. It's going to stay wide for a couple seconds in the edit, and then it's going to get into that tight coverage because it's a lot of dialogue on that show. So we know that, okay, once we get that wide coverage, we're coming in and we're going to be able to work through all of our tight coverage.
Tell us a little bit about painting out boom poles.
There's a couple different rules that we have to follow before we can decide that we're going to, what we call, we're going to bust the shot or we're going to drop into frame. And, the main rule is that the camera has to be static. Whether it's one camera, two cameras, if you want to, whatever camera we wanted to bust has to be static. Because essentially what they're doing is, they are just taking a plate of a space behind wherever the mic is and just repeating that plate. Nothing can be moving. So the camera can't be moving. And then in the room, we can't have shadows cast, any shadows of actors casting against the back wall where our poles will be crossing. So our poles can't cast shadows at all. We can't, cross anything that's moving. If we're on location and we're inside and we see through a window and there's traffic outside, we can't have our pole crossing that space. If there's clouds moving in the sky, we can't have our poles crossing that space. Focus shifts is another thing. So, any big focus shifts, we can't bust there. We can figure out ways to work around focus shifts by, if we need to come in, get a line, if we know a focus shift, and talking to our focus pullers who are amazing, if we know that they're going to shift for this line, but I need to come in and get that line that they're trying to get, we can be out and then almost either watch the camera motors or listen to the motors chirp a little bit, or know what cue it is. And then once they pull that focus, they essentially need 6 frames to repeat that background, to plate that background. So as soon as that focus pulls back, we can drop in, get the line, and if they're going to pull back, we got to be out before they pull back. So sometimes there was a lot of strategic planning going into when we would bust shots. And it was also kind of figuring out whether it was worth it or not for certain things. There are a lot of scenes where we would bust almost every day. We'd bust shots almost every day. Sometimes they would be for close-ups. We need that extra inch. If we're on like a location, we just need that extra inch of oomph. So, we just kind of bust for like one line or whatever. But sometimes, big wides, if we know that we're going to come in for coverage, we can bust, or if it's not that, we can bust, but we won't play it tight. A lot of people and a lot of, sometimes we had day players come in, mixers and boom ops for second units or whatever. And, obviously, if you find out that you're allowed, if you can meet this criteria, you're allowed to be in the shot. Yeah, I'm going to be right on top of that. No, you can't. You still have to play that perspective, at least for House of Cards. And, in my opinion, the way we operated was very much perspective focused. We're in a wide shot. We're not going to put that 50 2 inches over each actor's head. We're going to split that difference a little bit. And the 50, that thing reaches. We would play wide shots on 50s, even busting. We'd be 3-4 feet away, and that thing would sound great. It would be sharp, still have that body to it, but you would still feel the room. And we played that a lot. We would do 2 booms on big wides, and I'd get one side of the couch, and Chris, my utility, would get the other side of the couch, and we kind of play with it. And we also knew, it's a coverage show. Depending on the director. Some directors didn't like doing coverage, but they tell you. So we'd always know what it is, and everyone was super open about talking about it. So, busting the shot became a normal thing for everybody. If privately with Lorenzo, the mixer, we talk about it and be like, he's like, oh, so you think you can bust it for this? Like, yeah, I got it. I got this, and this is happening. There's no one crossing, or there's someone crossing at this point. So I'll come out, they'll cross, I'll come back in. And Lorenzo's also watching on monitors back at his cart. So he'd also, he has a Mix 12 as his mixer. And when he keys for his, PL slate mic, it buzzes. So a lot of times, instead of him just saying, okay, come in, he'll just buzz us. He'll just double tap his slate mic, and we'll know when it's safe to come in or whatever. So, and then Gary and Aaron, our operators, would do the same thing. We'll be like, hey guys, we're going to bust. And like, okay, get in there. They'd roll, and we'd hear the camera fans on the reds go off. And we'd know at that point, by the time we heard the fans go off, like a second or so had elapsed, and we could come in, post, they want as much clean plate as possible. So we try to give them that as much on the front end or the back end. So a lot of times, if we want to get a scene going, we'll hear the fans go off, and we'll wait, 1-2 seconds, and then we'll drop in. And then if we know that, say we're doing 2 booms, and Chris is on 2 people on one side of the room, and his last line is finished. He got his last line. We'd have him pull out, because there's no need for him to take up that space. He'd pull out of the shot. I'd finish. And then once we know it's, the scripted lines are finished, and it's a very heavily scripted show, once that line's done, I can kind of slowly come out, but still stay over him. But, I can come out of it, and that way they're not having to replace all of those frames. So anything that we can give them, we try to give them. And we try to sneak it in a lot of times in moving shots when, there's a lot of times that shows all dance floor and dolly. So it's, if we know that I can bust a shot for this line here, and then we know the dolly's going to move back and boom down. So right when that happens, I'll come out, the dolly will move back and boom down, reset. And once it's set, and I tell Gary or I tell Aaron, the operators, and the dolly grips, Ralphie and Frenchie, once it's set, Gary or Aaron, they'll usually just wave me down, or Lorenzo watching will buzz me and say, okay, come in, and I'll dive in real quick and get the line and come back out if they're going to move again. So it was always like this really interesting dance, and it added so much potential, but also so many more problems to deal with when we knew that we had that in our arsenal. So, I mean, and I know that I'm sure I missed a couple other criteria, but it was pretty specific. But, Lorenzo was really dialed in on it, and I got really dialed in on it, and our operators were super dialed in. So it was a great weapon in our arsenal, and it was always fun messing with new directors with busting shots, because we wouldn't tell them. So we do the first shot of that episode, so they come in for a 2-episode block, and their first shot is up, and it's a big wide, and we're always laughing, like, we'll see how they freak out this time, or I see how this one kind of, takes it. And some of them know already, but, a couple of them have, we've dropped in. It's like, okay, we drop in and we're already rolling, and AD says action, and the director's back at Village like, whoa, the usual thing. Director's like, wow, boom's in the shot. What are you doing? And we're all kind of like, what? What do you mean? It's okay. It's fine. And then the DP's usually sitting right next, either sitting around or sitting close, and they'd be like, no, we can do that here. And then we had one director that said, we told him that, it's like, he cut and he came in, he's like, someone explain this to me. What? How is this possible? And then we're like, okay, well, we'll explain. It's like, then the AD was like, oh no, let's get the shot and then we'll explain later. So once we got the shot ended, he's like, all right, boom guys, what the hell? Like, how is this possible? And we can explain it to them, and they're just, all of their responses are just like, wow, this is amazing. And it really helped. It really, I think it was a big part of why the show sounded so good and so upfront, and just because we could use the 50 on everything. It was awesome.
Yeah, it's a great technique, and for some of the listeners that don't know, in post they crop it, and they've got this still, and they can just put that over the shots of the booms, and because it's above everybody's head, and it just covers it up, and so it looks like a perfect shot, and the boom is right there, but it's covered by a plate basically that we shoot without stuff. So.
Exactly. And it wasn't just us too. We did this one scene where one of our actors was in the Oval Office, and they had to be, throughout the scene, they were eating a whole apple. And at the end of the scene, they'd throw the core out in the trash can in the Oval Office. So we did it a bunch of times. This actor was, I was like, I can't eat a whole apple every time. It was a long scene, and he's eating and then doing lines and eating. So for the wide shot and for some of the close-up stuff, we'd get plates, and then our set dresser would bring in, our props would bring in a trash can for him to spit in. So we'd do, it's like, okay, we got the plate, so bring in the trash can. So the trash can would be set up right next to the couch. And he'd take a bite and then wait a second and be like, okay, hold. And he'd spit out the apple and come back and like go right back into the dialogue and take another bite, spit out the apple. And he could just do that, and, it was there. Can't tell you how many times we put the B camera in the A camera shot. They want to do a big wide and a nice, pretty dolly move on the left side, but the end of the track has to be in the shot. They just do it that way. They just have the B camera just creep into shots, and it's like, as long as no one's crossing it, it's not a big deal. It's totally cool. So it was really fun. It was really awesome. I'm hoping that I'm hearing that it's being adopted by a lot of other productions, not as much in the US, but I know in Europe they've been doing it a lot, and I hope it gets adopted because, it's a huge weapon. But it's expensive. And, with House of Cards, everything was done internally where they did all of our editing. So they actually cut the show with the booms in the shot, which was really interesting. So they'd cut the show with our booms in the shots. And then once it was picture locked, then they would get rid of everything, which was really interesting. Because, it saved time and saved money for them because it's less time to paint stuff out. But it's pretty cool.
Wow. So with all that booming, is everybody laved up as well?
When we're on location, we would usually wire a lot of people just because we don't know what's going to happen, strenuous noises and whatnot. Knowing what we're going into, we wired a lot there. But if we knew that we didn't need a wire, we wouldn't wire. But on the stage, there'd be days where we wouldn't wire at all because, we got lucky and there'd be a lot of static wides and then all tight coverage, and we'd play it on the 50. And I know there's some mixers that like to fight for every single inch of, room between that mic and that frame, or that mic and that source. And, it was something we did that plenty, but, if it sounded good on the 50 and we didn't have to bust it, we'd save them money. Or, if it sounded good on that mic and we didn't have to wire a certain person or a certain actor, we just wouldn't do it. We'd figure it out. Most of our actors were great. You always run into people that don't want to get mic'd up, but they're all so professional. And Robin mic'd herself every morning. We had an assortment of mics, COS-11s and B6s in her trailer, and I would always be communicating with her costumer, letting them know, hey, it's this mic, this color. If I knew that I would always ask her like every morning, like, hey, what's she wearing in these scenes, this scene, and this scene, and say, oh, she's wearing this scene, this costume, and it's got she's wearing a button up or a white button up. I'm like, okay, use the skin tone B6, and I'm going to hide it behind a button. Or if it's this other thing, I'd be like, okay, you don't have her place it on her skin, leave it hanging, because I'm going to put it in the clothing, or I'm going to put it in her dress or something. So always constantly communicating with her like rapid fire, because as soon as the rehearsal ended, I would ask her, okay, what's she wearing? Okay, use this mic and have her put it this way. And, she had Spanx with pockets in the inside of the thigh, which is something that, we've always used. And we always had, and our costume department on House of Cards were phenomenal. And they made dozens of these black skin tone white Spanx with our transmitter pockets in different sizes for all of our day playing actresses, everyone. So it was always a funny thing talking about that. Hey, are you? The actors would come to me to get wired, and I did most of the wiring on the show too as well. And they'd come to me to get wired and be like, sometimes I'd know them or whatever, but I'd be like, hey, are you wearing your Spanx? And they're like, what? And the costumer would be with me, and she'd be laughing like, oh, I forgot to set it out for you. Or sometimes they even set it out, and actresses were like, oh yeah, I saw them on my table. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to wear them. And then we'll explain to them why we put them out. And they're like, oh my God, that's genius. That's awesome. Thank you so much. And I know a lot of shows use it, but I've been using it for a long time, and it makes a huge difference. Not use, before that, everyone used, we had the thigh straps, which is great, but always create that ripple on the skin. So all these tight dresses, especially in these politicals where you have all these tight dresses around down the legs, you'd see that ripple in the clothing, or you'd see something wouldn't be clean. And once you use the Spanx with the pocket on the inside, it works so well.
All right, so explain to the listeners a little bit your setup regarding when you're monitoring the boom, and then you're also listening to IFB and communicating with the sound mixer. Kind of explain that setup so people understand.
So the utility and I listen on Lectro R1A IFBs. We don't do it on this show, but hopefully the next show we'll start doing this. But we would love to be able to use the R1A to its utmost potential and have multiple channels. So we did that a couple times where, we'd have when you click it on, it's channel A, and it would be just the boom. And then if we wanted to hear the mix, if we wanted to hear the wires, we'd tap the button and switch over. So it gives us options. But yeah, we listened on R1As, and then our talkback was for all the seasons before that. And what most people do, we use our booms to talk back, but there's nothing private about it. So if I wanted to say something private, I'd have to say, go PL, and he'd pot the fader down and then just PFL listen on his end. But season 6, I wanted to change that because, I don't know, we wanted to be able to talk to each other when we weren't near our booms. Because there's a lot of times where I was going off fixing a wire, and if Lorenzo was asking me, hey, you done? Are you good? You need anything? And I'm like yelling across the room to reach into my mic, or Chris, my utilities, bringing his mic over for me to talk into. It just became too crazy. So we just got these, they sell them at Gotham. I think they make them for you custom at Gotham. It's just, walkie-talkie microphone keys that we wired to a universal 5-pin for Electro, and a TA5, and we just wear transmitters. So I would wear an SM, and that would go straight to my walkie-talkie talkback, and that would go, he'd loop that back to his cart, and that would go, it'd be working through his venue. So he had 2 venues, and be working through his venue, and he would just have it set up where it just loops to his right headphone. So it's not being laid down anywhere. It's just going to playback. So nothing's being recorded. And, he can leave that fader. He just runs it to, he just had it be pre-fade on like channel 12, which we like, because we almost never did more than, a certain number of tracks on that show. So, and whenever we needed to talk, we'd key and, go straight to his ear, and no one else could hear, and we could walk away from our booms. And it changed a lot. It helped a lot. And, and the R1As have great range, so there were a lot of times where Chris could go back to the truck and we could talk to Chris at the truck, or, say, hey, can you grab these? And it just changed so much rather than having to either text or, have them bring their boom with them. It's great. And even for me, because I have a wireless boom whenever I boom, so I always put my HM up at the top end of the mic with the new K-Tech squids, which are really awesome, really good with handling noise, and they're super secure. We had the ambient, I can't remember it's the QAS little flange that would pop out off the side with a connector on it. And we had it at that time, and then sometimes they just started popping off. The HM would like pop off and like drop into frame sometimes. It's like, oh, this is not good. So we found that when the squid came out, I'm like, oh, this is genius. So we started using the squids, and that was great. So even with that on my pole, I still had to carry it around, but I didn't have to worry about my cabling. But having that talk back, it was just made things a lot easier.
And that's the thing too, is like, yeah, when you're on set, and if you're talking into the boom or making comments, everybody can hear it, right? Your directors, your AD, everybody. But if you've got that quiet, it's just between you and the sound department, basically.
Oh yeah. And it was funny because people didn't realize, we didn't tell anybody that we were doing that because, they don't need to know. It's a sound bubble. They'd see me on set with a walkie and talking into a walkie, and PAs or, ADs would come up to me like, hey, can you walkie to this person back at costumes, or can you talk to them? I'm like, no, how could I talk to them? I'm not on walkie. They're like, well, you're holding a walkie right now. I'm like, I'm not on walkie. This is my PL. What are you talking about? They're like, wait, what? And once I explained it to them, I'm like, oh my God. And then they all immediately would come up to me and pull my PL out of off my shirt and just start saying stuff to Lorenzo. Like we messed around so much on that show. It was such a blast, that show. And for such a serious content show, as soon as they said cut, everyone was we're all just laying back. It was so much fun laying into each other. Like, just, if you didn't have a thick skin on that show, you wouldn't last, just because from the crew, we would just rip each other constantly. And a lot of it a good amount of it fell on the sound department, but most of it in the sound department fell on Lorenzo, our mixer, because there's a lot of times where Chris and I were on set all day, every day together, and Lorenzo's just by himself off at his cart. People pick on us all the time, but now we had that PL, people would come up and be like, hey, Lorenzo, they'd just be able to say whatever they want to Lorenzo. But the best part is that he couldn't talk back to them. He couldn't rebut it, so he couldn't come back at them with a dig. So we'd have to relay whatever dig he said to those people. It was always, we had a lot of fun. But that PL was a great addition to the last season.
So what are some of the conversations you're having over the IFB with the sound mixer for people who don't know?
Sure. Yeah. So with that PL, a lot of times sometimes I won't even go back after rehearsals to talk to Lorenzo. So if after I watch a rehearsal, and after rehearsal happens, I'll usually stand by Gary, our A-camera operator. I mean, Gary was incredible. He shot that show. Our DPs and Gary shot that, and Aaron, our operator, shot that show like crazy. But Gary just was so tuned in and so experienced. So directors would flock to him and be like, Gary, what do you want to do? Or sometimes, what do you think would be good? And Gary would know, but it would be me, Chris, our utility sometimes, and our key grip, our gaffer, DP, focus puller, and other operator. And they'd just be listening in on the director, the DP, and Gary's conversation about how we're going to cover it, what we're going to do, and how to keep it House of Cards, because House of Cards had a very specific look to it. So we'd all kind of listen in on Gary, and, he'd say it out loud and say our coverage out loud. And then as soon as it was almost like, we huddled around Gary and say break. Okay. So I'd go on my PL and I'd say, hey, we're doing this shot. It's static. We can bust for this. It's 3 people. So I'll grab these 2 people on the couch. Chris can come in and grab, Robin, who's standing at the end of the couch, and we can bust the shot, and boom. And the other coverage is 2-shot, single, and then, wide over single. Boom. And so I usually would communicate that back to my mixer as we're going through a setup. Sometimes things change, or, they bring in a light that pushes me out for some reason. So I can say, hey, I got pushed out. I got to find a new location, and sometimes they'll ask, what happened? Is there anything you can do? What do you need? And there's some things that, obviously as a boom operator, I control set. Boom operators control set. And they deal with their issues. They talk to their key grip, talk to their gaffer if they need to deal with shadows or reflections or anything. And our key grip was great. It was rarely an issue. One of the first days I worked on the show, our key grip came up to me and said, introduced himself and said, just so you know, boom shadow is not a sound problem, it's a grip problem. And I was like, wow, okay, cool. This is how it goes. This is the way it should be. And he's like, yeah, that's a grip problem for the most part. But, so I'd always communicate with them and was always open about it. But if there are certain things that we had to fight for, and, I did my best to fight for it, and it would come back negative, then I would communicate back to Lorenzo and say, hey, I might need you to come in and talk to them about this because it might screw up with our coverage or, whatnot, or, maybe you need to come in and explain to them why we need to do something this way, or, we might need to even fight for just to get some wild lines. We did a lot of wild lines on that show too. Plus, you always want to keep that line of communication open. As a boom operator, you try to be on set constantly, and you're always just watching and seeing what's going to happen because things could change. There are so many times where they'd come in and say, oh, we're going to do a static wide. Okay, and we'd set up for 45 minutes for a static. And then the director would come in and say, about a little push. And then all of a sudden we'd go from 2 booms, no wires to, 4 wires, 1 boom. So I'd need to be there to make sure I listen in on that and be able to communicate back to learners like, hey, change of plan. We got to do 4 mics now. So let's get those rigged up and let's talk to the ADs, and, I'll talk to the ADs and let them know that we need to wire up 4 now because we changed. Sometimes coverage changes, costume changes, stuff like that. So that's a lot of stuff that I will communicate back to him. And also I can communicate to my utility. So our talkbacks would also be able to, we'd talk to each other. So I can be like, hey, Chris, I need this carpet. A lot of times we'd cover a lot of marks, and so we'd have to, hey, let's, bring carpets in and bring the tape roll in. And then I'd communicate to the seconds, hey, we're going to cover up some marks here, and or we need this from the truck or whatever. So, it's always keeping that open line of communication. The sound department is the only department that's not on walkie-talkie on sets. So, we call it the sound bubble. We're in our sound bubble. We only talk to each other, and we have to constantly be talking to each other. And, it's the only way that we're going to be able to be prepared on the day. Because if I'm not relaying changes to my mixer about blocking, or who's going to be able to get what on boom, or if he's got to pull up a wire, or if we need to, after the first take, if we realize, oh, we made a mistake, we can't get this on this boom because of this and this and this, we need to stop and wire, so hey, prep me a wire. There's even some times where if I'm booming, I can try to boom with one hand and key and be like, hey, I need, during the take, if I'm quiet enough from farther away, be like, hey, this is why we need this, or blah, blah, blah. Like, keeping that line of communication is super important. I mean, every other department, they're just constantly talking back and forth about what you're trying to do to get to the point where you can say action and just go. As long as you're keeping that communication open and you're constantly feeding information to each other about what's happening, what's changing, why certain things have to happen a certain way, then everyone's on the same page. Because the last thing you want is, a mixer not on the same page as your boom operators. He's only seeing it through his monitors for the most part. So a lot of times they're buried, so they're only seeing it through the monitors. So it could be a tight shot, and for some reason you can't be where as tight as you need to be, and you need to be able to communicate why you can't do that to that person before they roll. Especially because the last thing you want is a mixer to pull up a fader that's not working. It's like, okay, where's the boom? And he's just reaching for that fader, reaching for that boom. Where's the boom? And we're just sitting there like, so you don't want that. You want to make sure that the mixer knows so they can do their job, and, and we can do our jobs. It's all about synergy. You got to keep it flowing.
Yeah, it sounds like it was a real cooperative set, and the crew got along, and you guys had fun. But yet, everybody's got each other's back. Versus sometimes it's not always the case.
It was exactly. Yeah, no, it was totally such a family feel on that show. It really was, and we got taken care of from the top down. It was a show that, there are a lot of guys on that show, like our operator Gary J. has been operating for well over 30 years, and our dolly grip, Ralphie Shearer, has been, it's one of the best dolly grips out there. And they've been in it for a long time. And they'll say, this is the best show I've ever been on. And, it might not be because of the content, but it's the people. And it was almost the same crew every year we came back. I day played on House of Cards seasons 1 through 4 because I was full-time booming on Veep. And every time I came on a set as a day player, it was like I was there every day. It was so welcoming, you know, and it was one of those moments where, like, if you've proven yourself to be a part of this team and you can do this workflow and get this job done and make this show, then, you know, yeah, you're family. And everybody was family on that show, offset, onset, no matter what, you know, and everyone came back. We all came back because it was a great job. And we worked really short days. I mean, not really short, you know, we loosely, but, you know, on our contract with Netflix and with MRC, you know, we couldn't go over 11 and a half hours, 12 hours any day without express permission and from our UPM, who would have to ask permission from higher ups as well, if we can go over. But we could never go over 14, ever. They would never let us do it. So, you know, it would be, if we had a 7 a.m. call, it'd be, you know, 6:30, 6:45. And Boris Meldon was our UPM, unbelievable guy. He'd show up and he'd just stand there with his arms crossed and start tapping his watch and be like, let's go. Come on, let's go. We'd get it. You know, we had very rare long days. You know, it felt good to be a part of a show that lasted that long. You know, our seasons were 13, except for the last season, it was 13 episodes. So we did 10-day episodes. So it was like around 130 shoot days straight, no breaks. We took no hiatuses, just Monday through Friday, some Saturdays, just straight. And it was, you know, we felt it. You know, you always feel it because it's always exhausting. But we all kind of showed up to work kind of smiling and being happy to be there because it was always fun. You know, every weekend we shot season 5 and season 6. Myself, my utility, our B camera operator Aaron Henning, and our dolly grip Ralphie Shearer, our other dolly grip Frenchie, and almost all the rest of the crew and the cast. We shot a spin-off of House of Cards on the weekends just for fun. We were shooting with our cameras in the stages at lunch. You know, our UPM gave us permission to shoot on our stages on the weekends. You know, hey, yeah. So we were shooting with them, and we shot with Michael Kelly. We shot with Kevin. We shot with Robin. We shot with everybody. So they all wanted to get in on our short film, and we always screened it at our wrap parties. And we did that all the time. And every weekend we'd all hang out. You know, we'd all spend time together. Wednesdays was karaoke night. So there was a little tiny bar across the street from our stages. So Wednesdays karaoke night. I didn't get to go as much, but Robin would go almost every Wednesday with the whole crew. And, you know, it was amazing. It was pretty remarkable. So I'll never forget that experience working with that group of people and working on that show, because it was just above and beyond anything I could have ever imagined.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about Veep. So it's the HBO series Veep, starring Julia Louis-Dreyfus as the vice president. So tell us a little bit about working on that series.
That was my first full-time show, was season 2. Getting on that show was kind of a funny story. My wife worked on season 1 of Veep, and she got to know everybody and all that. But at the Veep season 1 wrap party, I came with her. And I wasn't a union member yet. I just graduated college, still, you know, freelancing, but she took me to the wrap party, and we show up, and there's no one from the sound department was there, but they're trying to play the blooper reel on the TV screens at the bar, but the sound wasn't working. So everyone's everyone's in an uproar. Julia's on the bar, like, what the hell's going on? Everyone's going crazy. And one of the producers, Dana, was like, where's the sound department? And they couldn't find him. And Jessie, my wife, was just like, he's a sound guy, and pushed me to Dana. And Dana grabbed my arm and pulled me. He's like, okay, come on, you have to help us. I'm like, oh my God, I'm petrified. I'm like, what? No, I can't be the one to fix this. So she grabs me and drags me to the DJ booth at the wrap party. And they're like, all right, this is what we're playing it off of. You know, we're not getting sound. We got to figure this out. I'm like, okay. So I took 5 minutes and I looked around, and it was playing off a laptop. So I found a 3.5 to RCA. So I looped it through the DJ station, and I put into the DJ station on the second fader and just cross-faded it over. And all of a sudden it started working. And I got it done like really quick, and everyone screams in the bar. And I'm just like, oh my God. And Dana's just like, oh my God, you saved the day. Like, who are you? Like, do you have a card? I was like, actually I do. And it was like, I just ordered cards because I just graduated. I'm like, oh, I need business cards, So I had a card. I'm like, oh yeah, here's my card. And she's like, okay, yeah, you totally made it in my Rolodex. You just totally saved us. So thank you so much. Like, I might call you. I was like, okay. So I'm like, oh my God, that was a crazy experience. And then a couple months later, Veep season 2 is coming around. It's end of November, and Lorenzo Milan calls me. So Lorenzo, who's the mixer on House of Cards, was the boom op on Veep season 1 and 2. So, and I had done some work with him a little bit, but he calls me 3 weeks before Veep season 2 starts and says, hey, our sound utility, Steve Lafayette, is sick. He can't come do the first couple weeks of the show. You want to come do it? I was like, sure. Okay, cool. And he's like, all right, someone's going to reach out to you and talk to you a little bit about it. I'm like, okay. So who calls me but Dana, the producer? And she's like, hey, you're the same guy that saved the day at the rap party. And I said, yeah. She's like, okay, yeah, you're totally hired. Absolutely. Like, you're on. So it was like this crazy full circle moment that was like, of course, the one producer that calls me just to kind of chat with me a little bit about the job was Dana, this woman that I helped at the rap party. And I ended up on the show, and I did the first 3 weeks as a utility. And just before the 3-week mark, we heard back from Steve, the utility that was on season 1, that he wasn't going to be able to come back. He had some pretty severe medical issues. So the job was offered to me to take over as a utility. So that's what I did. That was kind of history. Lorenzo just came off of mixing on House of Cards the second half of the first season, which he got because I was day playing on House of Cards as a boom operator, utility, playback, second unit mixer. I did a bunch of stuff season 1. And Mark Weingarten was the mixer, and he said, hey, do you know a local guy that could take over? Because I got to go. He needed to go do Hunger Games 2. So he's like, can you know somebody that could take over locally? I said, yeah, Lorenzo. So Lorenzo came in and did filled in for Mark for I think a week or 2, and everything worked out. So Mark was like, yeah, it's your show, and gave it to Lorenzo. So he finished that, and then he went to boom, and he was like, so he boomed season 2 with me as a utility. And that was probably the greatest workflow season of Veep, because it was, Lorenzo had done first season. He had 20 years experience as a boom operator in Baltimore. He was the boom operator on The Wire, Homicide, The Corner, everything. He was the guy here in the area. And, I learned everything from him, especially on that show, because that show is all wires, nonstop wires. And it's a crazy show. So, to put it in perspective, some people would say a normal shoot day for a comedy might be like 11 pages a day or 10 pages a day or less, who knows? Veep was almost consistently 20 something pages a day. And this is for a 5-day episode on a 28-minute episode. And they would have like 60 to 80 page scripts. And we'd shoot it all in 5 days. So, and it was always took over a number of days, script days. So there were tons of costume changes, tons of action. Every season they added more and more principal cast to everything. So, I remember season 1 and 2, our wireless setup was, we had a remote tree that was on that we would remote to set, close to set with shark fins. And it was the old 6-pack. So it was 6 411s in this box. And then if we ever needed more, and one was always a wireless boom, and then we'd have 5 wires, body mics. And it was like, we almost always had more. So we'd slap 411s just with the whip antennas onto the sides of this box with Velcro and just daisy chaining into this freaking hodgepodge. It was crazy. But it worked. But every season they added more and more and more. So eventually I told the mixer Bill, I was like, hey, we need to upgrade our wireless. We need 2 venues. We need a Meon on those venues. We need, powered antennas. We need this stuff because this show's such a heavy wire show. We got to deal with this. It's like, okay, cool. So then we finally upgraded to 12 wires, and that got us, that we were comfortable there. But yeah, it was just a crazy experience, It was always, with Lorenzo and, continuing on the show, it was always pre-wiring. We'd finish wiring the scene and be like, okay, let's look to the next scene. Okay, we have these 5 actors plus these 4 actors coming in. These 5 actors need to do a wardrobe change, and we need to pre-wire these 4 other actors. So I would always pre-wire the 4 actors just with wires, no packs. And then once that scene was over and the other actors would have to go change, they'd have to rush and go change. So we'd quickly have to pull their mics off, have them change, figure out our assignment for our transmitters for the next scene for all the people that were pre-wired. And then when they would come back changed, we'd rewire them real quick. And then season three, I did 3, 4, and 5. And 3, 4 were in Baltimore and 5 was in LA. And, on those seasons, I predominantly wired everybody because there's so much going on, and I was comfortable with everybody. And I learned how to be really fast with wiring. It got to the point where we had to wire people. You got to get wires in these ties in like 20, 30 seconds. And it was all ties, which was helpful, totally helpful. I've mastered the tie. If anybody ever wants to know how I mic a tie, I've mastered the tie.
Tell us real quick how you do the tie miking.
Okay. I'm sure other people do this, but the way I always do it, it depends on the kind of tie, kind of knot. If it's a double Windsor, if it's a half Windsor, which side of the shoulder you're going to run your mic up. But mics always run up the back if there's a jacket on, and tape down the seam of the jacket down the middle of the back. Loop it behind the collar, and then it's wrapped around wherever side is the high point of the knot. So the knot, I think it's a half Windsor. There's a high side and a low side. So you always want to go on the high side because that'll help hide the cable going into that. With a double Windsor, it doesn't matter because it's high. I think it's double Windsor. It's high on both sides. So it doesn't matter which side. And then I always do COS-11 with a half hush lav. So just rip a hush lav in half, and I wrap it with Joe Sticky stuff or butyl if you're on the West Coast. And I just wrap it with that, and then I'll pull the mic through, put the hush lav on, wrap the butyl on, put it into the tie, and I'll squeeze the tie around the mic. And 99% of the time, that is the quietest mic that you'll experience in a knot. And I've tried it all. And it's so quiet just because it keeps that mic so stationary. Because even if you just put a hush lav in the mic, if it's a loose knot, that hush lav might move around and still make that ambient noise in there and that scratchy noise. And just with that butyl on it, keeps it so secure. Especially when you're getting into people running or doing stunts, that thing will stay there. It will never go. As long as you keep enough slack, that thing will never go anywhere. So it got down to this science of just like ties. And at this point right now, I'm sick and tired of ties because it's just all politicals with my life, with Veep and House of Cards. It's just ties and ties and ties. I'm so done with it. Yeah, Veep was, I would wire maybe like 50 times, 60 times a day. Our average day was maybe 16 hours, 17 hours every day. And then our longest day was season 3 on a Friday. We did a 23.5-hour shoot day. We had 5 company moves. And the last location we were on was on a freaking Coast Guard boat, shooting boat to boat. So we had 2 cameras on small dinghy boats, and the cast were all on a main Coast Guard boat, like a small ripper boat. And we had 8 talent on the boat speaking all at the same time, going crazy. It's like, oh my God, it's hour 17. I'm about to get on a boat. All the camera guys are loading onto little dinghy boats, and we're about to go out to sea and shoot these 2 long scenes out on the water. I'm like, damn. It was just a crazy, crazy show. It was, our call time would be 7 a.m. Our shoot call would be 7:15. And, I'd have to have anywhere average between like 5 to 10 wires on people in 15 minutes. So there was a lot of time where I came in. If my call time, and they rarely gave me enough pre-call, so I would technically come in a not so happy time and an hour before and prep all my radios and scan all my radios and get everything ready and just go and zip. And, it got really fluid. It got to a point where they'd all line up. I'd say, hey, I'm wiring over here. I'd tell the ADs, hey, I'm wiring in this room. So they just, as soon as they're ready, they'd come right to me and there'd be a line of them and I'd be like, hey, what's going on? And I'd talk to them for 30 seconds. Okay, your mic, go. Hey, next one, go. And it was just this assembly line of wiring every day. But it was great. And the casts were amazing. They're super easy. Julia would get pre-wired every day by her costumer. So I just have to give her a pack, and she wore the Spanx on the thigh too as well. Almost every day she had a dress on. If she didn't have a dress, she had pants. It'd be on the ankle and she'd be pre-wired, and she sounded great every time. And we did combinations with her. We did moleskin sandwiches with the hush lav in there, taped to the bra. We started doing the hide-a-mic bra clips. They were great. And then I found a little issue with them where if you clip them onto a bra, the front of a bra, they'll actually squeak because the friction between the the metal frame if it's a metal frame bra, the tension that it puts on that small little clip on that hide mic, it'll actually start squeaking. So what I had to do is I had to take a small little piece of moleskin and just wrap it around the back end on the inside of that clip, and then it took away the squeak because it wasn't plastic on plastic. It totally got rid of that squeak. So I had to figure that out. But once we did figure that out, it was great. So we'd do that clipped onto the bra with a piece of tape or moleskin underneath it, or a transport underneath it. Yeah, I mean, it worked out really well. It's just a wire-heavy show. It was a tough show to boom. 2 cameras. Then now season 5 we started 3 cameras, all on Zooms. Going around everywhere, improv. A lot of times where they'd be in like a circle talking to each other, so you can kind of float around and kind of cue back and forth. But it was hard. It was a tough show, and it wasn't boom friendly in terms of lighting. It was a lot of top light because you'd see almost 360 and everything. So you couldn't really have stands anywhere. So it was all top light Kino banks. And it was but yeah, it was a lot of perspective booming. Because a lot of times people think, oh, if you put wires on them, okay, you don't got to boom anything. Well, no, like boom is so useful because it takes that curse off those radios. It takes that loneliness almost of a wire and puts body into that mix. And, playing that perspective is super important for your mixer and for post, giving them that perspective of whatever that lens is. It's, it helps tremendously, especially with a wire heavy show like that, where they're all talking over each other. It's all improv. You got to have something that's going to liven up that space. I don't know. It was just an exhausting show, and the schedule was crazy too. There's a lot of rewrites. We'd shoot 4 days and be like, oh, we need to rewrite the script. So we're going to go on a brief hiatus for like a week to 2 weeks, but we'll let you know how long it really is. So they never really told us like what that hiatus would be. So, it was 10 episodes, 5-day episodes. So technically 50 shoot days. We'd do 53 shoot days in like 6-7 months. And, we'd always shoot over the winter time. So it was always like Christmas break was always like 6 or 9 weeks long, and it sucked. But because we knew that we would come back into it and we'd work for like a week or so, and then all of a sudden we might be off for 3 weeks, or just 2 days or 3 days, or sometimes we'd come in and be like, we'd shoot for 3 hours and be like, all right, guys, go home. We don't have, we're not solid on this script yet, so we're going to call it a day. I was like, what? It was total circus, totally nuts. But, we all handled it and got through it, and another great crew. And God, that cast, I still talk to all the cast to this day. A lot of them, we got really close over the 4 years I worked with all of them, to the point where season 5, they asked, they helped to request me to come out and do the show when it moved to LA, which was great. So, I didn't move out there, but I ended up joining 695 as well, and going out there, and it was the same mixer, Bill McPherson, and they wanted me to come out because they were familiar with me. We were very, we were all really close, really tight, and I was sad to not go back. But, in that hiatus between 5 and 6, I got on House of Cards full time, season 5, and had to take it because working with my mentor, Lorenzo, I'm properly boom operating a show, and I'm home. I got to be with my wife and, my dog, and my friends and my family. So, plus it was better pay too. So going out to LA, I had to work as a local. So that was rough. I ended up breaking even essentially at the end of that show. That 7 months, I broke even after all the hiatuses and Airbnbs and rental cars and flights and last minute stuff. It killed me, but I'm glad I went. I had a great experience, met a lot of good people, but Veep will always be a beast to me, but I cut my teeth on that show. So.
Yeah, if you can handle that, you can handle anything, right?
I mean, that's what I kind of, attested it to. A lot of times I'd go to other shows or movies, and I'd wire up and I'd be fast. You had to be, and you had to be fast and efficient on that show and not have to go back and tweak. You could, but you have to be quick on it. And I'd go on a show and I'd wire and be like, wait, what? You're done? Yeah. It's like, oh, okay. So like immediately ADs loved me because they were like, oh, you just get it done. Okay. You're proactive. You just go for it. I'm like, yeah, come on, let's go. Yeah. Like that was my big thing that I cut my teeth on with Veep is wiring and just speed, efficiency, accuracy, and speed. Speed is one thing, but accuracy and speed is big. You got to make sure that you're doing it right the first time and you don't have to adjust it. You practice that much, you get it down, which is great. So I'm glad that was my first show because it totally changed the way that I work.
Well, let's talk about Kill the Messenger. That was a film that I really liked. It stars Jeremy Renner, and you were boom op in D.C. on that one. So tell us a little bit about that experience.
Well, not much to tell. DC, living in DC, you end up working on a lot of movies and TV shows that come in for a day. So Kill the Messenger was just a day. It was me and Dennis Towns was the mixer, another local guy here in Baltimore that has a couple Emmys under his belt. Great guy I boom for all the time. And I don't know. I can't really say much about Kill the Messenger because it just was one day, so quick, And when you work in DC, you get so used to the same locations over and over and over again. You're either at the Lincoln Memorial, you're at the Reflecting Pool, you're at the pool by Congress, by the State House. It's the same places. So like, you just get so bored of them. There's always this conversation people sitting on the ledge of the pools outside the Capitol. There's, this raised area right in front of the Capitol that have these two big copper lions facing each other. There's always walk and talks there. Lincoln Memorial. God, I can't tell you how many, and I haven't even been doing it for that long. I've only been working now for, professionally 11 years, but union 7 years, I think, or 8 years now. And, it's just, I can't tell you how many times I've been on those damn steps and know that, people come in and say, hey, we want to roll up there. We want to roll sound up and, shoot up under Lincoln at his feet. And it's like, no, you can't do that. It's illegal. They're like, what? It's like, yeah, you can't roll sound. You can't have sticks. You can't put wireless anything like up there. You just gotta, if you want to do it, you got to do it guerrilla style, not tell anybody, but there's a point where the steps change color, or really, I think it's granite to, I can't remember, but it's the main, like the top section of steps at the Lincoln Memorial. You can't step foot up that area into the top area with a camera with sticks or with any sound equipment, and you can't record. So you got to do it secretly. It's really interesting. But yeah, just Kill the Messengers was just one of those days. We shot in all those locations, and it's always crazy. And it's usually at the end of it's usually the last shoot day of a feature or a show. So people that at least travel are just like over it. And now all of a sudden they're in DC. It's impossible to park, impossible to drive anywhere. And it's noisy and crazy. So you just wire them and see what happens, and that's what happened on Kill the Messenger. And that's what happens on almost everything I do in DC.
All right, the big question is, what is your worst on-set experience?
So there was a day we were doing a ride along with our police officers. So we had one of our officers, our main officer, hiding in a tree in a back alley. And he was mic'd up, and we were me and the camera operator were around the corner with his partner. And he was waiting for a hand-to-hand because he knew that there was a certain location under this tree that this one big dealer that was always meeting. So he's waiting in this tree, and he waited for like 30 minutes, and lo and behold, here comes this guy, and here comes somebody that's about to buy. So we're like, okay, great. So he turns his body camera on. He gets hand-to-hand. He gets everything. And okay, so he has, intent to sell. He has the sale. He has everything. So he jumps out of the tree, goes to arrest the guy that was purchasing. The dealer starts running. So he starts running away. The partner comes out around the corner and grabs the guy that was buying. The other officer who jumped out of the tree starts running after the perp. So we get some footage real quick of his partner getting the buyer, and then we start booking it after the other officer. So he's like gone. He's going down this alley. We turn this alley. We find him way out there, and he's really getting down there. And I hear him on my wire calling it out on walkie to his partner where he's going, so we can follow him. So there's a point where he turned a corner. Camera operator and I turned a corner. And almost right before we turn that corner, we hear pop, 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 pop. And I hear it on my mic, and it whizzes by. It's not snapping, but it's close by. So we immediately stop. And we, the rules were, if that happens, immediately about face, go back to the officer's car and wait. So we did that. We're like, oh, we should get out of here. So this is the most oh shit moment I've ever had in my life. So we go back to the car and we come back, and the officer comes back, and he ended up getting the guy, which is good. But it was the craziest thing that happened. Just turns out that as soon as that guy turned the corner, he had pulled out a gun and started blindly shooting behind him at the officer. And all the bullets, they were just in the air. Never even came close to the officer, and never even came close to, hitting us necessarily. But we heard the shots, and we heard him hit the wall the brick wall of the garages in the back alley, and we saw the bursts off the brick. So we're like, all right, let's get the hell out of here. That was a that was a terrible moment. And there's another one that is just so embarrassing, but I'll say it because it was a learning experience. It's one of my first jobs ever, commercial. It was like a local athletic wear commercial. And pretty much the commercial was a woman with running shorts and a sports bra running down a street. And it was all on Steadicam, and sun was behind us, really hard to boom, really fast moving. So we had to hook her up with a wire. But we were going to see the front and the back of her. So we couldn't put the pack on her back of her sports bra because it was eventually she was going to turn a corner and we were going to see her running away. So we had to figure out a way to hide this mic on her. So I'm like fresh out of college. I figured it out, and we used a skin tone B6, and I kind of taped it along the far camera side of her body. And then, her shorts were luckily not too short, but they were short enough where it was an issue to try to find a place to put the transmitter. So I couldn't get it in the back of her shorts. Couldn't do a waist strap around the shorts. So I had to do a thigh strap tucked way up in the shorts, essentially. But she's jogging, so it had to be it had to be really tight and like figured out. So I go to mic her, and I put the pack on her, put the strap on her. It looks great. She says it feels great. She's like, wow, I'm really impressed you got this. I'm like, yeah. And I walked away feeling super good about myself. And she walks away and goes to her one, and they call action. She starts jogging. And immediately as she starts jogging, she stops, and she's just like, oh, I need the sound guy right now. You need to cut. And I'm like, what did I do? And she sees me and she pulls me around the corner. We're on the sidewalk, and she pulls me around the corner and she said, you got to move the antenna. And I'm like, oh my God. I was so embarrassed that I had set the transmitter with the antenna pointing up. So you can imagine what was happening with that antenna. It was doing things it should not have done. I was so embarrassed, and my mixer's just laughing his ass off at me. And I was so embarrassed, and luckily she was super cool about it. She's like, no, it's all good. And we had a good laugh about it, and we fixed it and put we got a different thigh wrap that set the transmitter on its side and got it all secure, and it all worked out just fine in the end. And that was the most embarrassing moment. It was just, and there's a lot of embarrassing moments when you wire people. You're always, especially when you meet some actresses that might have come from theater and they're way comfortable with themselves, and it's just, whoa, okay, this is too much for me, and they kind of just let it all hang out for you. But God, that was a really embarrassing moment. And that mixer still, to this day, if I work with him, he will not let that down. It's like, you know where you put that transmitter, right? I'm like, you stop it right now. Another one was when I went to Veep in LA, second week, I'm so stressed. I, put myself up, everything, working as a local, not making any money, but I'm working on the show and I'm trying to be grateful about it. I go to the chiropractor and I get my knee worked on, and I've had my meniscus torn twice and surgically repaired twice. And I get my knee worked on and I tear my meniscus in half, week 2 of Veep. Man, and it completely cut in half and retracted into my knee joint. I was in so much pain. My knee was like inflated to be like a freaking watermelon. And I worked on that torn meniscus for 3 weeks with a giant metal brace on my knee as a boom op, running around essentially, with 1.5 legs. And I was in so much pain. And luckily they put us on a hiatus, and I was like, I got to get this figured out. So I saw a bunch of doctors, and I ended up getting stem cell injections out in Hollywood. And it totally saved my life, man. I took one day off of work, and I took a Friday off, got the injections, rested all weekend, went back to work on Monday. It felt great. So it was like, it ended up being amazing, and ended up being this crazy eye-opening experience for me. But God, it was the biggest nightmare, because I just, I screwed my leg up so bad. And I'm like, God, what am I going to do? I can't just leave the show. It's my livelihood. And it was like, but it all worked out in the end, which was cool. But God, that was a nightmare.
All right, so now tell us your most favorite on-set experience.
So I guess like one of the best moments I've ever had on set was really it took over the course of 2 years. And over the course of 2 years, I worked with Joe Biden 3 different times while he was vice president. The first time was on Parks and Rec season 5. He came to DC and did a couple of days day playing and on season 5. And I was the boom operator on Parks for season 5 in DC. And, I got to know him there, true politician and a great guy, and mic'd him up, super nice. And then a couple months later, we're doing this short film for the White House Correspondents' Dinner intro video with Julia Louis-Dreyfus and Joe Biden. So we spent a week with Joe, which was really interesting. But, first day I show up on set, Julia's happy to see me. She didn't know I was going to be there, and I knew her from Veep. So she's like, oh, that's so great. Let me come introduce you to Joe. And she brings me to Joe, and Joe's like, hey, Steve, what's going on? Like, immediately remembered who I was, remembered my story, like just the brief 5 minutes we talked when I was micing him, was talking, and Julie's just like, what the hell? Like, okay, cool. Like, Joe, that's really weird. And we had a great week, and the last day of shooting, I will never, ever forget this moment. So the last day of shooting, we're at the Naval Observatory where the vice president lives. And there's a big steel gate that leads to the half circle driveway of the observatory. And we're shooting our last scene there. It's at night. It's Joe in this bright yellow Corvette convertible driving Julia to the gate and she jumps the gate essentially. So we're about to do our last setup and, Joe is in the car and he puts it in reverse and goes to his number ones and he just says, hey guys, just letting you know, I only have time for one more take because Marine 2 is going to land right there in front of the house and pick me up in about 5 minutes. And we're like, okay, we all laugh like, okay. Lo and behold, 5 minutes later, here comes Marine 2. So Marine 2 comes and lands right on set. And we finish the scene and Joe gets out of the car, hugs Julia, hugs the director, producers, whatever, and says, all right, thanks guys. It's loud, the helicopter's right there, the rudders are going, it's windy, and he starts running to the helicopter. So dumb me, I'm walking back to my mixer and my mixer's like, did you get the wire? And I immediately panicked. I'm like, oh my God. So without even thinking, I just turned and started sprinting as fast as I could to the Vice President of the United States while he's got his back to me and trying to get to Marine 2. So I'm running full speed at him, yelling, screaming his name, Joe, wait. And I look up, his Secret Service guys are all communicating on their walkies like, I can only imagine what they're saying, but they're all like moving towards me, slowly, moving towards me. And we're about to get under the rudder. So I'm like bending down and Joe's bent down already. And I guess Joe caught a glimpse of one of his Secret Service agents that looked panicked or like that were looking a different way. So he turned and looked at me and he immediately associated like, oh man, and he immediately realized that he had his mic on still. So he's like, oh, and he throws his hands up. He's like, oh, I'm so sorry. And so here's me and Joe Biden under the propellers of Marine 2, screaming at each other, trying to talk to each other under the noise and the wind. And I'm trying to pull this mic off of him. And the whole time we're just laughing. And he's just like, man, they almost got you. It's like they were getting ready. I'm like, oh God, I don't know what to do. So I'm pulling the mic off of him. And he shakes my hand and pulls me in for a, one-handed hug. And he's like, thanks so much, man. It's been a great week. Turns around, gets into Marine 2 and waves off everybody. So I'm there like ducking down, waiting for the chopper to take off. It takes off. And I turn around and the entire crew is just dying. All of their jaws are dropped because they're like, you have no idea what we all thought was about to happen. Like, you were sprinting so fast to the vice president. His agents were so ready to kill you in that moment. And I was like, I had no idea. I was just like, oh, okay. And they were just like, oh my God. And came back to the mixer and he's just like, you could have left it on him. Like, it's okay. Like, no, I had to go get it. And everyone was just like, damn, that was the craziest thing I've ever seen. I'll never forget it. The next year, Parks and Rec season 7 came and we did the same thing. We shot at the observatory with Joe. And we had Amy Poehler, Adam Scott, Aubrey Plaza. And he comes down the steps with his wife, Jill. And he, says hi to everybody. And first time meeting a couple of the actors and meets the first AD and says, oh, it's time to get you mic'd up. And, this is Steve. And he turns and sees me and he's like, you got to be kidding me. And he throws his arms around me and gives me a huge hug in front of everyone, in front of Amy Poehler, everybody, all the cast, all the crew. Gives me a huge hug. He's like, how are you? It's been so long. I haven't seen you since that time we almost shot you. I was like, what? And I'm looking over Joe's shoulder while I'm hugging him, and I see Amy Poehler and Adam Scott, and all. They're like, what? Like, who is this guy? You know, I mic'd him up, and we were just catching up and talking, and he's like, I still tell that story and he said that he still tells that story to all of his friends and his family about the time the sound guy ran after him and almost died trying to get a microphone. It was the craziest experience, but you know, God, I love Joe. He was great. He's amazing. Such a class act guy, and not to mention just really good actor too. So yeah, it was just an amazing experience with the vice president.
All right. So if some of our listeners wanted to get into location sound, what would you recommend they do?
I mean, get your hands on gear, no matter what. Anything you can do to get your hands on gear. You know, I took classes. I went to film school, a super small film school in Baltimore, and I took my class. There was no location sound class. It was all post sound. So I learned everything just from trial and error. Lots of error, lots of trial. Like, you just have to put your hands on the gear, put headphones on, and listen to stuff and figure it out. Change your gain settings, learn about gain structure, learn about signal to noise ratio. I mean, when it comes to mixing, it's all about signal to noise ratio. I mean, if you can balance that, and if you can understand signal to noise ratio and signal flow, you can do anything. All that other, you know, figuring out the best placements for mics, you know, that all comes with experience, but you know, if you can understand workflow, especially if you're going in and you want to be a utility, and like, you know, my first day as a utility, I came in understanding signal flow. And it was one of the first things that my mixer pointed out to me my first day, was just like, you really know how to run, you know, how to run audio, how to run line, how to run signal. I'm like, yeah, if you know how to run signal, if you can figure that out, everything else will come with you. But, you know, get your hands on gear and meet people. Don't be afraid to speak up to people, meet people, introduce yourself, be outgoing, be eccentric in a way, you know, do things that are going to make you uncomfortable, you know, because you're going to spend your whole career being uncomfortable at work because it's going to be difficult. Like, you strive to be comfortable in work, in any work you do, but, you know, especially with what we do, because it's so highly technical. And the more you put yourself into uncomfortable situations, the more comfortable you'll be. I'll tell you, my first ever union day was on House of Cards, season 1, the pilot. And I got a call from my wife. I was working my part-time job at my school as a tech. She called me, and she was working craft services on House of Cards. And she said, hey, you're going to get a phone call from Mark Weingarten. He's the sound mixer. At the time, I didn't know who he was, but Mark is huge. He won an Oscar for Dunkirk. He's worked with Chris Nolan, Fincher. You know, he's just done so much. He's a great guy too. She's like, you're going to get a call from Mark. You're going to answer that phone and you're going to say yes to him. I'm like, okay. So Mark calls me and he's like, hey, so we need a playback guy next week. We have a big playback day. Are you a union guy? And I was like, yeah, but I wasn't. I was not a union member at all. I was thinking about it, but I hadn't joined yet. And I was like, yeah, I'm a union guy. He's like, okay, cool. You ever do playback? Yeah, I've never understood it at the time. I was like, I knew what playback meant in general, but for film, I was like, what? It's like, oh yeah, cool. He's like, yeah, so, you know, got a big day, you know, we're using a lot of earwigs. You ever work with earwigs? I'm like, yeah. I'm like, never worked with earwigs ever in a day in my life. And didn't even know what they were at the time. And I just said, yeah. And I just kind of went for it and was like, I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm just going to do it. So I hung up the phone, immediately called the office, joined the union, got in a couple days, showed up on set like an hour early. And I was petrified. You know, there's 2 50-foot techno cranes in this giant banquet hall. We're shooting this huge 300 background scene, ballroom dance scene. And I'm in charge of 26 earwigs on my first union day ever. It's like 26 earwigs. I'm like, Jesus. And Fincher's directing. And, you know, Kevin and Robin, all the #1 actors are there. And I'm like, what the hell did I get myself into? But luckily, everything was already set up. They had a preset day. So playback station was set up, all based off Audacity. You know, I had speakers run through the house and had a Comtech base station running the earwigs and, you know, hard pan left and right. And Mark explained it to me and he said, you know, this is what you got to do. David Fincher is going to come over and explain to you what he wants, when he wants it out of the house, in the house. and when your cue points are, and it'll be great. I'm like, okay, so my first day, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. I'm putting out 26 earwigs to strangers to background that have never used earwigs, and I'm being directed by David Fincher. He came over, and, true Fincher fashion, came over. He's like, okay, here are your cues, this, no introductions. Here, this, and this. Here are your cues. Can you do it? And I said, yeah. He's like, okay, you better get it right. And he walked away. And I'm like, I'm pissing myself. And Mark is behind me at his cart laughing his ass off because he knows exactly what's going on. He knows I'm pissing myself. So we do the rehearsal and I get it right the first time. And as soon as they say cut on rehearsal, Fincher turns around, looks at me, gives me a thumbs up. That was it. That was that was that day. And we got into that day. So I was like, okay, I got the first take in. And we did like 63 takes that day of the same thing. So obviously in that time, I lost track of it, so I messed up a couple times, but I got like the first 20 right. And I managed the earwigs right, put them all out to actors, put out to our string quartet on the stage, to all of our male dancers, everything like that. Ended up working really well. I just put myself in a super uncomfortable situation, but it all turned out all right because, again, I understood signal flow. I knew how to run it. They told me what to do and I did it. And after that day, Mark was like, hey, you boom? I'm like, yeah. He's like, all right, cool. We'll bring you in. And I started day playing a lot on the show. And that, and those were my first union days. We're on House of Cards and working with Mark. And, it was all because I lied about not being a union member and, whatever, but got me in the union and got me my first day. And my first day was crazy. And after that, it was almost smooth sailing, but, put yourself in awkward situations. You shouldn't say no to a lot of things, especially if it's going to make you uncomfortable. You want to be uncomfortable because if you can figure that out and if you can work through it and have thick skin and get through that time, that rough time, and come out at the end of it and have a great day, what else are you going to work for? I mean, that's it. You get through your days and that's it. And if you can put yourself in those situations, the more you do it, the better. So I think just understanding basics and getting your hands on gear and just putting yourself in uncomfortable situations will only make you better at anything you do, whether you want to be a boom op, mixer, camera, set dresser, doesn't matter any business, just make yourself uncomfortable, because if you figure yourself out in that situation, you'll be great.
All right. Well, Steve, as we kind of start to wrap things up, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
You can get in touch with me by email. It's saadasound@gmail.com. That's SAADA sound@gmail.com. I'm on Instagram at the same handle, Saada Sound. Don't really spend a lot of time on Facebook, but I'll check it maybe like once a month. But it's just under my name, Steve Saada. Yeah, I mean, that's about it. Feel free. I'm open to talking to anybody about anything. And yeah.
Awesome. All right. I want to say thanks to Steve Saada for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was awesome. I appreciate it.
Thanks, man. And a big thanks to all of our listeners out there. If you'd like us to discuss a particular topic, please send us an email at locationsoundpodcast@gmail.com. We would love for you to subscribe and leave us a comment. We're available on Apple Podcast, and for Android users, check out Google Podcast. Also, we're on Stitcher, Spotify, TuneIn Radio, and on your favorite podcast app. Until next time, remember, sound is half the picture.